Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 337, Astrakhan, Kazan, and Crimea, a History. Last time, we ended our two-part series on the history of the Soviet space program. Today, we cover the history of the remnants of the Mongol invasion, the three major khanates, Astrakhan, Kazan, and Crimea. When the Mongols invaded Russia in 1223, they did so as a unified force. Their subsequent return and domination of Kievan Rus in 1237 solidified their rule under Genghis Khan's son, Ogadai. Under his rule, the Mongols remained together under one banner. Still, there was an ongoing dispute amongst Genghis's other sons, Tolui, Chagatai, and Jochi, as to who was next in line. The Toluids would dominate the others, but this would lead to a festering rivalry. Mongol Khan would follow Ogadai, but after he died in 1259, the Toluid civil war broke out. While Kublai Khan would ultimately emerge victorious, the divisions within the numerous families would result in four separate khanates. They would be known as the Golden Horde Khanate in the northwest, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilk Khanate in Iran, and the Yuan dynasty in China. The one we will be concentrating on is the Golden Horde, as it is here that the khanates of Astrakhan, Kazan, and Crimea originated. Several other khanates emerged from the disillusionment of the Golden Horde, including the Uzbek, Kasim, Kazakh, and Sibir, but they did not have as significant an influence on Russia as the three others. I will mention these khanates when and if they play a role in the history of the other three. Before we can delve into these three khanates, we need to have a discussion on why the Golden Horde and the Mongols as a whole disintegrated into smaller parts. One of the most commonly overlooked reasons was the Black Plague, which affected almost all of Europe as well as the Mongols in the mid-14th century. One of the first incidents that demonstrated the impact of the pestilence on the Mongols was the siege of Kaffa, which began in 1346. The horde was angered by the Genoese and Venetians for several snubs over the years that Khan Janibek viewed as insubordination. While the Genoese and Venetians had suffered greatly during the siege, it was the Mongols who suffered the most. As Marie Favreau writes in her epic work, The Horde, How the Mongols Changed the World, quote, Gabriele da Musi, an Italian notary, recorded that during the siege of Kaffa, an epidemic broke out in the Jochid ranks. The mortality rate was so high that, reportedly, no more than 1 in 20 Mongol warriors survived. She further writes, quote, Musi also provides an early account of biological warfare, as the Jochids apparently catapulted infected body parts into the fortress. By 1337, the Italians were hit by the Black Plague, and they also realized that the Mongols had already suffered the consequences of the spread. While this weakened the horde, internal fighting ultimately led to its collapse. In December of 2025, I will dedicate an entire episode to the Mongols and their collapse, exploring their impact on Russian history, culture, religion, and politics. Another significant reason for the collapse of the Mongol Empire was economic factors. With so many elite members of European and Russian society dying, trade began to crumble along the Silk Road and other paths that merchants traversed. As Favreau put it, quote, the horde was tied to a world that had begun to unravel and could not help suffering as well. To add insult to injury, the Northern Hemisphere was going through a period known as the Little Ice Age at the end of the 14th century. This would lead to large swaths of land with no inhabitants. This would, in turn, lead to new territories being carved out of the old Golden Horde / Mongol Empire. This would become the three khanates we will be discussing today. Let's begin our historical journey with the one khanate we actually have the least information about from their early days, which is Astrakhan. According to Alan Frank in the book Cambridge History of Inner Asia, when discussing the rulers of Astrakhan, quote, "The dates and activities of these rulers are faintly represented in the sources, when they're represented at all." Before we proceed, we need to locate this khanate's position. It surrounds the delta of the Volga River as it empties into the Caspian Sea. To the north were the Nogai horde, and to the west was Crimea. It was the capital of Astrakhan, and the khanate itself was established in 1466 by Mahmud Kin bin Kukchek. It did not become independent, however, until 1502, when the Golden Horde had completely disintegrated. Bin Kukchek was a descendant of Toka Temur, the 13th son of Jochi, who was one of the sons of Genghis Khan. This was a common occurrence, as the only way to make a claim as a leader of one of the khanates was to be a verified descendant of Genghis Khan. Astrakhan was a natural location for this faction of the Golden Horde, as it was a long-time trade center. Being at the end of the Volga, which led to the Caspian Sea, made it very popular. It had been inhabited for millennia before the Mongols, and in particular by the Bulgars and the Khazars. We first hear of the city in 1333, as it was an incredible hub of activity. It would be utterly destroyed in 1395 when Timur, also known as Tamerlane, and his army invaded. It would eventually be rebuilt and become the capital of the Khanate in 1459. The ruling lineage is nearly impossible to discover, so obviously we're going to pass on that. What we do know about Astrakhan and its 90-year history as an independent Khanate is that it had military and diplomatic relations with Crimea, the Nogais, the Circassians, and very likely Kazan. Although admittedly, there's almost no real evidence of this. We're just taking this as probably a very likely event. With Moscow having broken the Mongol yoke pretty much completely by 1480, and we'll discuss this a little bit more later on, Astrakhan knew it had to somehow deal with them, which it did in 1532 when it began diplomatic relations with its northern neighbor. Astrakhan, like many of the other khanates, would regularly capture Russian peasants and sell them on the slave trade markets, of which the capital of Astrakhan was one of the largest such markets in the region. This was one of the most imperative reasons why Moscow had to take control of this khanate and eliminate the threat of slavery to its people. Concerned by the growing power of Moscow, Yamgurchi of Astrakhan decided to become a nominal vassal of the Russians. In 1552, as we will talk about a little later, Kazan was besieged and taken by the forces of Ivan IV, which rightfully concerned the leaders of Astrakhan. They feared the inevitable, so they allied themselves with the Crimeans and the Nogai. In response, Ivan sent 30,000 troops against the Astrakhan Khanate. By 1554, Yamgurchi fled the capital, attempting to collaborate with the Crimeans to counter the attack. It failed, and by 1556, with more Muscovite troops rushing in, Astrakhan was taken and the slave market was destroyed. In 1558, the Ottomans attempted to take the city, but they were totally rebuffed. Our next khanate to discuss is Kazan, and its origins were similar to those of Astrakhan, although the inhabitants were more of a Bulgar ancestry. As with Astrakhan, very little written history has survived the passage of time. Many of the documents about the early days of the Kazan Khanate were destroyed after the siege of Kazan, including those of the early Russian colonial administration, also known as Prikaz Kazanskogo Dvorca, which, of course, were lost during the time of troubles. The first Khan of Kazan was Ulugh Muhammad, who took the leadership in 1438. He would be one of 15 Khans, some of whom would ascend to the throne multiple times. Ulugh would be one of only 4 independent Khans of the Kazan, along with Mahmud, Zalil, and Ibrahim. The first dynasty of the Khans lasted until 1479. It was during Ulugh's reign that Kazan initiated a series of raids into Muscovite territory, as the Muscovites were in a weakened state due to the civil war known as the Muscovite War of Succession, raging between Vasily II and his cousins. It was also around this time that the Muscovites would begin their attacks on Kazan, with most, if not all of them, being unsuccessful. In 1479, the Khanate of Sibir gained control over Kazan, led by their leader, Ilkhan Gali. He would have 2 reigns, the first of which began in 1479 and ended in 1484. And I'm hoping I'm going to pronounce this name correctly, but it's Moksa Madamin of Kazan, a nominal pro-Russian Khan appointed by Ivan III, became leader. Ilkhan would overthrow his successor in 1485, but that would only last for 2 years before being overthrown by Moksa Mamaddin once again. He would reign for the next 12 years before Mamluk took over, followed by Gabdulatif. In 1502, here we go again, Moksa Madamin would return for a final time, but this time he would begin to waver in his allegiance to Moscow, when, in 1505, he ordered the slaughter of all of the Russian merchants in Kazan. After he died in 1518, with no children to pass along his reign, he would be replaced by an 11-year-old named Shah Ali. His first reign would only last 1 year. Now, Shah Ali was a direct descendant of Jochi Khan. Again, he was the oldest son of Genghis Khan. Now, he would be overthrown by Sahib Girai, who was placed in power by his brother Mehmed, the Khan of Crimea. His reign lasted for 3 years until he was ousted by the Russians during a failed siege and replaced by Safa Girai, who was only 13 years old. His loyalty to the Russians would last for 7 years until he was overthrown by internal factions by an even more pro-Russian John Ali. John's reign would last for 4 years until he was murdered and Safa returned to the throne, where he married John's widow. Installing an anti-Russian Khan would increase the hostility between Moscow and Kazan. Numerous raids during Safa's leadership between 1535 and 1546 occurred in Kazan, but none of them were really consequential. Finally, in 1546, the Kazan nobility threw Safa out in favor of Shagali, but that would only last for 1 year. The next few years would see 4 Khans try to take control of Kazan, with the final one being Yadigar Muhammad in 1552. In 1550, Yadigar assisted the Russians in their failed attempt to take Kazan, but he was eventually forced to retreat to the Nogai Khanate before returning in March 1552. By that time, Ivan IV had decided that enough was enough. He would gather a massive Russian army to once and for all take down this thorn in the Muscovite side. Starting in 1469, the Russians besieged Kazan 10 times. Although the first 9 were unsuccessful, the Russians were able to annex land east of Kazan in the area around the Volga River. This significantly weakened the Khanate to the extent that when Ivan gathered his army in 1552, they were facing a force of 50,000 compared to the far larger army they had countered in the past. The Russians, learning from their past mistakes, ensured that the supply lines for their 150,000 men were capable of sustaining a long siege. Also, the year before, a fortress on the Volga, Ivangorod, later known as Vyshik, was constructed, which was to be crucial. The citizens of Kazan and their troops, along with 10,000 Nogai horsemen, had prepared for the siege to the best of their abilities. The siege began on August 22, 1552, with the artillery barrage beginning 1 week later. On August 30th, Alexander Gorbatai-Shuisky would lead his cavalry to defeat the inner cavalry of Kazan, and Andrei Kurbsky would lead his group to defeat an allied force known as the Sheremis or Mari. This group, the Mari, still has a presence in modern-day Russia to this day. Now, the Russians began to bring in their big guns, cannons that would batter the walls of the Kazan fortress. They also neutralized their enemy's artillery and began employing sappers to undermine the city's walls. Finally, on October 2nd, the walls were breached and the Russian soldiers rushed in. Most of the population of soldiers and citizens were slaughtered in the ensuing bloodbath. Estimates believe that anywhere from 20,000 to 60,000 people in Kazan were killed, with the Russians suffering around 15,000 deaths. While the city was captured with 18,000 men left behind to guard against a counterattack, the armies of Kazan did not give up the fight. With some help from the Nogai and Crimeans, they continued to harass the Russian military through 1556, but eventually this ended as well. The Kazan Tatars would remain in the region, keeping their language and their customs. A monument to commemorate the defeat of Kazan and Astrakhan was begun in 1555 and completed in 1560. It was erected on Red Square in Moscow and is known worldwide as St. Basil's Cathedral. And if you haven't seen pictures of it, you absolutely should Google it. Go to Wikipedia, go wherever, and find pictures of it. It is an astonishingly beautiful cathedral. Its original name was the Intercession of the Virgin, as the capture of the fortress of the city of Kazan was achieved on the day celebrating the Virgin Mary. Additionally, the defeat of the remnants of the Mongol Horde was considered a religious mission to defend orthodoxy against the infidels. One last Khanate would remain, and it would be the longest-lasting one, the Crimean Khanate. It was founded in 1441 and ended in 1783. The first Khan to rule over Crimea was Hasi Gerai, who came to power with the aid of the Lithuanians, who, of course, as we know, were in constant conflict with Moscow. Part of the reasoning behind the creation of the Crimean Khanate was that the remnants of the Golden Horde decided to abandon their nomadic ways. They agreed that the Crimean Peninsula was an ideal location to establish their own homeland. When Hasi Gerai passed away in 1466, his 6 sons fought amongst themselves for the title of Khan. Between 1467 and 1478, the position of Khan would bounce around from the sons of Hasi until Minli Gerai consolidated his power and allied himself with Moscow under the leadership of Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great. The alliance was a critical one for the Russians, as the soldiers that Minli supplied to Moscow significantly contributed to their victory over the last of the Golden Horde at the Great Stand on the Ugra River. Ivan III had decided that enough was enough with the payments to the Horde. The Horde's Khan, Akhmat Khan, vowed to avenge this slight. He would make an alliance with another enemy of Moscow, the good old Lithuanians, who were supposed to send troops to punish the Russians. Akhmat waited for his Lithuanian reinforcements to arrive, but they never did. Numerous attempts to cross the Ugra River were made by the Tatars, but each was repulsed. The stand was really not a substantial battle of any kind. Both sides simply sat across from each other, taunting their enemies, and I could just imagine the kind of taunts they would send at each other, hand gestures and insults and a bit. But for the most part, they stood around doing absolutely nothing. Still, the significance of stopping the Horde's armies was a bolster to the autonomy that Moscow would feel, as many believe that this was the moment when the Russians threw off the Mongol yoke that had lasted for over 450 years. Many historians argue that this marked the end of the Tatar suzerainty over the Muscovites, but it was significant to the Russians. It would signify the end of the Golden Horde, as the Crimean Tatars would crush them after the death of Akhmat Khan on January 6, 1481. But this would open the doors to the Russo-Crimean Wars, which began in 1507. These conflicts would continue for over 280 years, until the conclusion of the Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774. Within a few years of the Russian victory, the annexation of Crimea occurred during the reign of Catherine the Great. Between 1507 and 1783, these powers clashed, with the Crimeans having the support of the other khanates, as well as Russia's mortal enemy, the Ottoman Empire. It seemed like every spring, the Crimean Tatars would invade the Russian countryside, rape, pillage, and enslave the population. They were a constant thorn in the side of many of the czars and the Russian military. The Russian response, though, was calculated and slow, and it was to build a series of fortresses, towns, and outposts to counter the incursions. At times, they would be successful in protecting the citizens of the region, and at other times, they would be overwhelmed by the Crimeans' superior arms and forces. The Volga cities of Samara in 1586, Tsaritsyn in 1589, and Saratov in 1590 were founded as a result. At times, the Crimeans invaded Russia on its own. Many times, they were aided by the enemies of the Russians, like the Swedes, along with the Ottomans in 3 separate conflicts, with the Kazan Khanate in 2 of them, a trio of Kazan, Lithuanian, and Ottomans in 1537, and 3 other invasions with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The worst invasion of them all was known as the Moscow Fire of 1571. Devlet Giray, at the head of a Crimean army numbering 80,000, along with the big and small Nogai hordes and the Circassian troops, invaded, destroying a 6,000-man Russian vanguard. The rest of the Russian military headed towards Moscow, along with many civilians from the surrounding cities and towns. With the suburbs on fire, high winds carried embers into the walled city of Moscow. The ensuing fires caused the death of tens of thousands of people. Additionally, the Crimean Tatars took thousands of captives, selling them into slavery. The following year, in 1572, the Crimean army returned with Ottoman support. What they didn't expect was that the Russians were ready for them. The Battle of Molodzi would decimate the Crimeans, who would only return 20,000 horsemen from their initial army of around 100,000. The construction of hundreds of forts closer and closer to the Crimean border would begin the destruction of the threat to Russia. By 1774, Crimea had become a vassal state of the Russian Empire, which was formally annexed in 1783, as I mentioned before, under the reign of Catherine the Great. Of course, this would not end the historical significance of Crimea. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1855 would rattle the Russian hierarchy. Under Nikita Khrushchev, Crimea would be given to the Ukrainian SSR, which would be reversed by the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, mind you, an illegal one, because the Ukrainians had signed an agreement with the Russians saying that if we give up our nuclear weapons, you will protect our borders and not invade, which they did. And that marked the latest conflict in that disputed territory. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time as we explore the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution on the Russian people. It's kind of a two-part series, but with its center of the Bolshevik Revolution, because the following episode after that is the role of women in the Bolshevik Revolution and the revolution that brought down Nicholas II. And I'm here to say that if it was not for women, the Bolsheviks never would have gotten in power. The Tsar probably wouldn't have abdicated, and things would have been vastly different in history. And that's something that we're going to be discussing over these two next episodes. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.